right, it's Dr. Collins from Stuart, Florida, and we've got an advanced orthogonal seminar coming up on February 24th, 25th. So I just wanted to get your attention, and I'm on lunch doing some x-rays, so I thought you guys might want to do them with me using the advanced orthogonal technique. So I've got my screen share here, and I just wanted to kind of walk through informally how I do my films. But we'll just do a frontal x-ray and exclude condylar aberrancy, which is, the asymmetric height of one condyle to another, maybe for a future video. But just have a quick clip of, how somebody who practices AdvO might do their films, in case you were curious. So, first step when I am pulling up this frontal film, which is what we call it, is I'm trying to get a sense of where the sutures are. So those temporoparietal sutures, right? Because we're going to want to measure that 1 to 2 inches above as our most reliable points for determining the frontal cephalic line, which is what it's termed. So I sort of look for where that bone overlaps, because I want to stay north of that as not to get into any part of that junction in my measurement. All right, so kind of moving down, we can look at the condyles, occipital condyles, right? Just in terms of marking and preparation. So I picked this one because it's pretty clean, so everybody can kind of get a sense. When it would come time to do the aberrancy for the condyles, we'll have this lateral margin of it. But when we're talking about the condylar circle, historically, the rule was icing on the cake. So what you would do, let's just get these out of here. But you would put a dot, left and right sides, right on that, not on it, but just off of it, sort of resting on the surface. And then another one about a 1/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch medially on both sides. But with software now, we're not dropping a template on there. We can just drop our condylar circle. But for the sake of transparency in the technique of how we would do this historically. So the lateral aspect of the condyles is what we're looking at, is why I bring that up. Even though the template will sort of cover the entire condylar circle, really that lateral aspect is the weight-bearing aspect that we're most concerned with. And if I look, right, this 3 circumference, it's not doing the trick, man. These condyles are a pinch flatter than that 3, and that 3.5 was too flat, especially with that one on the left. So I would split the difference, and I would say 325. And in general, if you have to err on one side or the other, when it comes to the condyles, you would go for the tighter radius, and on an axial surface, you would go for the flatter. That's what I've been told. All right, so in my workflow when I'm doing my films, I start with the AXP, but it's really the DENS. It's going to be several points in one tool on the software. And I'm just throwing these up quick just to get them on the screen, eyeballing, and then we'll zoom in. But we want the lateral margin of the DENS to start. And historically, again, if we were doing like templates and, drawing on films, we're trying to find the lateral margin of the DENS where it will intersect with the C2 body. And I think probably the best reference tool here is going to be to bring up your axial view, which is a real blessing, and to have a reference like this. And we have a practice, I'm sure it's in other techniques, but in AdvO, that is called dimensional transpositioning. And the idea is because you have 46-inch distance, Bucky to tube, source to image distance, object distance, right? You should be able to have similar measurements, at least ratios, to try to find structures. Good example, right? Like the width of your dens at that base, right? Sometimes it's going to be covered up by your sinus structures, right? And it almost looks like to me that nasal structure there covers up what would be the dens. So I might even cheat that in a little bit. But I should be around 10.8 on my width. And her nasal structures do make this difficult. And then where is that C2 spinous? So in our axial view over here on the right, assuming this view is not rotated brutally here, we should have, we should be able to dimensionally transpose, just so we're not hallucinating here, right? Where that axis spinous is going to sit in relation to the lateral aspect of that dens. And sometimes it's tough when you got the sinus structures in the way. Oh, but just to give you an idea of how to troubleshoot this a little bit within the AdvO advanced orthogonal technique. And again, this only works if you're not rotated. Right, so we should be somewhere in this zone. But, right, how do I know in terms of height where that spinous is supposed to sit? Well, we can transposition using the sagittal film as well. It's a cool trick, right? Again, this is taken at 46 inches. So if I have the posterior arch, I know, right? Because I took this frontal film at this angle here. I don't know why I moved that. That was the same angle. But I took it around that, 20 plus line. So where the posterior arch sits in relationship to the C2 on this view, right? And we can even kind of cross-reference where that junction of the C2 body and the base of the dens are as well, right? We can get a pretty good sense of where that C2, the tip of the spinous process, is what I want to mark on my frontal film. So I should have a sense of that. It should be pretty close, right? On this view. So if I know, getting a little crowded here. If I know where my posterior arch is, right on my frontal film, it's a little bit higher than you might even think that C2 spinous would be, but we should be looking up here, right? And sure enough, I can make out, if I actually move that out of the way, that C2 spinous. Let me drop that line back over there. So right at the top of this little dot, you can't see my mouse cursor, but right here, that little dot, you'll get a sense of it. I'll mark it. right about there. Which puts me with my dimensional transpositioning pretty spot on. You know, I had about 0.9 mils. I'm right where I should be. And then rotationally, if I toggle back to my axial view, it should give me a sense rotationally, you know, where it should be as well. So if for some reason I just have a really hard time seeing this, dimensional transpositioning is a blessing, right? So feeling comfortable that that's where my C2 mark's going to go. C2's tip of the spinous process. And now we're going to move on down to the lateral margins, the lateral borders of C7. Which if you've got a pretty high S line, you know, you start getting above 15, it can be pretty blown out. So again, it's nice to have that axial view that's taken at a lower S line, typically, you know, 0, maybe around 10. Sometimes it's even negative. That'll give you much cleaner bodies. So one, you know, before you even get into that frontal view, if you want to look at the width, right? You get a sense of the lateral aspect of these, this body, this margin here, or whatever. All right, so you know you should be somewhere around that width. So if you just wanted to throw that width up, because it's tough, right? It gets grainy, it gets messy. And within advanced orthogonal, you have a protocol. When you get above 20, you know, with the combined Bucky angle and the height of the tube, you should be taking an additional view. It's an S2 at 10 is what we go by. But sometimes you're in the middle there, and you can still be kind of washed out down by the C7. So you have to do a little bit of troubleshooting so you're not overexposing everybody and just taking an S2 at 10. But visually, it appears that right margin is there. Let's see if that jives up with something on the left. And we can even bone enhance a little bit. Yeah, and sure enough, right? We have an edge here. So I feel good about that. That one was easier than anticipated. Cool beans. All right. So now we have our dens marked, our C2 spinous tip marked, and the lateral, I'm going to take that in just a drop. The lateral margins of the body of C7 marked. So we're cooking with gas here, and we got our condylar circle. So the next move I make in terms of workflow is moving up to the skull to get the FCL, the frontal cephalic line. And within advanced orthogonal, you use a process called zoning. And that's the template that we use for zoning. It's a little bit crazy looking, but it's not bad. Now, because we marked our temporoparietal sutures, little yellow marks there, we can scoot on up. And again, the most reliable osseous structure for producing your FCL for analysis is going to be the 1 to 2 inches above that suture line. So we use in the zoning procedure, you're going to have from A to B as your primary zone that you're looking at. You also have additional zones, so B to C, C to D, D to E. And ideally, all of those would be symmetrical on the film as you tilt it, up and down, side to side. But sometimes it gets a little tricky because you can have abnormal skulls, right? You can have a dent on one side of the skull, in which case we'll use a procedure called two zoning, which I'll talk to you about. But with this tool, I'm just above that suture line. And what I'm looking for is right to left sides. Do I have symmetry? So I'll be kind of sliding right to left and then tilting the tool, rotating the tool right and left, to have symmetry in terms of the skull in that A to B zone, which hopefully you can pick up decently with the camera. But I'm looking for similar bone material, and something else I can do, depending on the shape of a skull, is even tighten that tool up. So now you'll see it's kind of hugging, and I get more of a window where I can look at that dark space to get the symmetry. And it's kind of just, I would say this procedure in general is just an exercise in dialing it in until you're basically going back and forth, splitting hairs, and that is when it's right. Okay, let's zoom out a little bit. I feel pretty good about that. I'm not seeing market asymmetry. I got a little bit low below that suture line on the right, but we're not bad. So we'll say 1.3, but let's say that there was some kind of abnormality over here, right? Like, oh, geez, this guy had a serious trauma. What do, right? That knocks out your A to B zone. Well, you could do what's called two zoning. And you could skip and go above, right? So, or probably an even better example would be, you can tell I don't use that freehand tool very much. Okay. So let's say this guy has a huge dent. I could skip above and look at C to D as well, right? And kind of work back and forth and sort of avoid this area here. So I'd be looking, more of my reference would be between here and up here than that true, kind of zone that's 1 to 2 inches above. So you could kind of toggle back and forth and get it dialed in while ignoring that B to C range would be an example. I don't know if that helps describe it well, but two zoning. So I feel good about that. All right. And then let's look at the atlas, right? Within advanced orthogonal, you're not just going to drop an atlas plane at the posterior arch and lateral mass inferior junction, which is typical with the orthogonal procedures. You're actually taking the entire atlas in and looking for consistency in references. And so they call that majority rules. And majority rules, in a nutshell, is I'm taking the superior tips, the inferior tips, the, historic measurement, which is going to be the inferior aspect of the posterior arch, lateral mass junction there. And then you're also going to take, as your fourth majority rules, you're looking at, that superior aspect as well of lateral mass and posterior arch. So all of those basically, get those off of here, will give you a sense of the true atlas plane. And if, one of them doesn't agree, you kind of kick that out, even if it is that inferior aspect of posterior arch, which, historically is weighted as the measurement. But let's say 3 of those lined up and that measurement is asymmetric. Well, you have to give an account for, you have to give an opportunity for genetic variance there, right? It's not truly the atlas plane may be based on, the superior tips and inferior tips and superior aspect of the posterior arch. So just in workflow, what I do is I start off with that inferior aspect of posterior arch, and then I'll kind of roll it up to those superior tips, and then down, and start to see if there's some sense of congruency. And Lastly, if you have, it's 2 and 2. Let's say you got 4 references there, 2 and 2. From my understanding and how I've practiced is you take the one that does include the inferior aspect of the posterior arch. You still weight it more heavily if it's, a split decision. But this is what I'll kind of do is cruise across each of them. Try to get them to agree. And like I said, if it's split 2 and 2. So I feel good about the posterior arch inferior aspect, the superior aspect there, and then those superior tips. Who's a little bit funky is that inferior tip. I see a gap there. So I feel good with that. So that's what I would drop as my AFP. And then you drag these little X's out to the lateral margin of the mandible. And then again, I'm not going to go through condylar aberrancy because that should be its own video. But one of the additional measurements on this film that you're always going to do is measure using the condylar aberrancy tool over here on the left. Are the condyles the same height basically, or are they staggered because of genetic aberrancy that is giving you a false, upper angle? But again, we'll save that for a future. So just crossing T's and dotting I's. Where's that transverse process? And the one on the right. This is kind of how I button mine up. And then mastoids. With our procedure, there are slightly different angles. AO is this way as well. How do I set you up on that headpiece? What kind of angle? And so when I have my films up on the screen, I have a monitor in each room, so I get to look at this. And part of the angle is looking at these mastoids in real time to get a sense of the type of angle I need on the headpiece to stabilize them. All right, so that is my kind of quick workflow here. You would also have, from the axial view, you would drag in your axial surface, which I won't go into now, but just like you did the condylar circle, you would get the circumference of the C2 surface. And then from your horizontal view, we would have the atlas rotation relative to the skull. And then that information would come in and populate their listing. So I hope that was informative for whoever was watching, students, other doctors, to get just a sense of our workflow in advanced orthogonal. And again, we have a seminar coming up. It is going to be February 24th, so Saturday, and 25th, Sunday. It is our annual conference. So I would highly encourage you to come, and we'll be going much deeper down the rabbit hole, troubleshooting. This was just a quick kind of introduction if you've never seen this before, but troubleshooting tough cases, condylar aberrancy, a lot of the interesting nuances that make advanced orthogonal, what it is. But thank you for watching, and have an awesome day.